one Israeli officer once told me, look, we are like a bear in a cage. So you try to poke a finger, I will shake the cage so hard that you will run away and you will never want to come near me again. So the psyche says never again. That never again will we suffer what we have suffered.
What the Israelis experienced on 7th October, they have been perpetrating on the Palestinians for the last 50 years. It is a shock for them because they have never experienced this kind of assault upon themselves. But those of us who watch this region have seen the Israelis do this time and again, repeatedly on the Palestinian people, and has had no impact whatsoever on the Israelis.
That the conflict did not erupt simply on 7th October. And 7th October, of course, the events of 7th October, we must condemn. This kind of violence has absolutely no justification. But there's a long background. There was a two-state solution, which Israel had committed, and which has, just, drifted into nothing. So unless you address that political issue, a simply military, approach based on high tech does not work, which is what the 7th October events have shown.
First up, I would like to invite all of them on stage to help us, as I said, decode the implications of this way beyond the headlines into literally questioning who we are and how do we respond to situations like this. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Navtej Sarna, Talmiz Ahmad, and Dinkar Srivastava.
Where are you sitting?
I'm actually I'll sit here.
Okay, I want to be here so that's clear.
No, not live, but we'll be recording it.
But are you putting it out?
Yes. I'd just like to share one other quick detail about Talmiz Ahmad. In 2004, he was in part of a hostage situation where he helped release hostages, and that's an experience that we would love to delve into. And Dinkar also helped India, or actually shaped India's participation in the Chabahar port. So, as I said, they're all a rich repository, treasury of stories, experience, and knowledge. So, Navtej, I'd like to start with you. Like I was saying earlier, that even before we begin to discuss the big issues at stake, there isn't even a minimal agreement on the vocabulary around all of this. Does one call the Hamas militants or terrorists? Do you call the Israel government an occupation government in Palestine? Do you call it an apartheid regime? Do you call it somebody that's defending its own rights? The world is split apart. Universities to political parties to governments to societies are split on the very basic vocabulary around this entire conflagration. So how would you first define the Hamas and the Israeli government? Do you think these words of terrorist apartheid regime are fair?
Thank you, Shoma, and thank you for throwing me at the deep end. Well, first of all, thank you so much for including me in this distinguished panel and with such a distinguished audience. Pleasure to be here with everybody. It's all about where you stand. It's all about who you are. None of these are terms which are objective. Everything is loaded. So I think I cannot tell you what to call Hamas. I cannot tell you what to call the Israelis, the government. Everybody, every country every person now, it's come down to a personal level, is coming at it on its own. But if you look at as a dispassionate observer, which I presume is what we are here today, and not taking sides, the fact is that Hamas has several aspects. And I'm sure Ambassador Talmiz will be better qualified to talk about this. But Hamas has a political wing, Hamas has a military wing. And Hamas has also won a political election in Gaza in 2006, beating the other part of the political faction of the Palestinians, which was Fatah, and has governed Gaza as a political. Yet there is a militant wing. And there is you cannot dispute the fact that what Hamas did on October 7, whether or not they are a terrorist organization in the UN Security Council list of terrorist organizations, was a terrorist act. As far as Israel is concerned, I think the safest thing to say is Israel government or the IDF, which is Israeli Defense Forces. And then when you begin to get politically loaded, you can call it, depending upon where you are, an occupying country, an occupier, apartheid regime, and so on and so forth. So none of these are terms which can be used lightly. So I think for purposes of our discussion, it's best to simply say Hamas and simply say Israel. And I think probably, everybody can take a cue out of that from his own political standpoint.
So just before I bring everyone in to the conversation, Navtej, you served in Israel. You really understand the DNA of that country and the people. So do you think that this particular level of retaliation is something unusual in their book? What is the kind of, every country has a story about itself, a self-myth by which it lives. Do they see themselves as fair and just people? How does this level of retaliation, where there's 11,000 people and counting killed, amongst them 5,000-6,000 children, beyond a point the numbers don't matter. It's just the sheer scale of retaliation. How do you think, or are you in touch with people there? How is that self-perception?
Yes, I am in touch with people there. I have spent 4 years there. This level of reaction may not have been seen before, but it was entirely expected. Israel, what they suffered on October 7, will impact on Israeli psyche for generations. It is the worst day for Israel and in some ways for the Jewish people of Israel, and there is a slight distinction in terms of that this is never been so bad since Holocaust. And we have built up this country, we've struggled hard to get this homeland. And now, it's always at the edge of the Israeli mind that we are going to be hit again by everybody else. And there's a very commonly held belief that, everybody around us wants to throw the Jews into the sea. Now, this comes out of centuries of Jewish experience. So without trying to justify anything that's happening in Gaza, just to give you that point of view, that this comes from centuries of experience of victimization, discrimination, etc. And it is very deep in the DNA of people who are normal, ordinary Israelis. I'm not talking of the defense forces. So when something like October 7 happens, in any case, even in previous situations, if there is a slight provocation, one Israeli officer once told me, look, we are like a bear in a cage. So you try to poke a finger, I will shake the cage so hard that you will run away and you will never want to come near me again. So the psyche says never again. That never again will we suffer what we have suffered. Fine. In that process, the reaction that has happened, which looks absolutely disproportionate to all of us, to the rest of the world, they don't seem to think that it is disproportionate. If you hear their spokesman on television every evening, it is very clear that, we will never allow, we want to destroy Hamas. We will never allow Gaza to be used as a platform ever again for launching rockets and terrorist activity into Israel. And 3, we want to bring every hostage back. Now you must remember, in Israel and amongst the Jews, it is considered terrible if a person dies abroad or is killed abroad and is not brought back and buried with all, particularly the believers amongst the Jews. I remember when we had the Mumbai attacks, there were Jewish people killed in the Chabad house. And I was the ambassador at that time. They went to all sorts of lengths to make sure that no possible body part was left anywhere. And they have a special unit called Zaka, which actually goes out. There's more of a religious doctors than anything else, who make sure that the body is put back in the similar situation and buried properly according to all the rites. So the fact is that, 240 hostages is huge. One soldier was exchanged about 12 or 13 years back for over 1,000 political prisoners that Israel held. So this is the kind of psyche that you are dealing with. So, they don't see this. We'll come to that whenever you give me a chance, but there will be aspects amongst the Israelis who will see things differently. The rest of us see things very differently from what's happening in Gaza, as you prefaced the remarks. I mean, the kind of violations of law, etc., the disproportionate act. But I'm just trying to explain to you
the
what
psyche
goes
from which they are operating.
This.
Yes. Talmiz, I would love to bring you in here, because this is like a Rashomon story, where every perspective is different, that somewhat addressing the same question. One is that the Hamas would have absolutely known the psyche of the Israelis and what level of retaliation there would be for the kind of brutality that they unleashed on 7th October. So again, drawing on your experience there, can you help us understand the psyche of the Hamas and the Palestinian people? Why would they do this? What do you think occasioned this kind of unbridled attack? And with this level of savagery, is the savagery unusual? Is it new? And what would have driven that newness of brutality that was unleashed on 7th October? And just one more into that already large question is that, Navtej spoke of this long history of persecution that the Israelis suffer from. Help us understand the Palestinian sense of history and injustice as well.
What the Israelis experienced on 7th October, they have been perpetrating on the Palestinians for the last 50 years. It is a shock for them because they have never experienced this kind of assault upon themselves. But those of us who watch this region have seen the Israelis do this time and again, repeatedly on the Palestinian people, and has had no impact whatsoever on the Israelis. In 2014, the Israeli armed forces entered Gaza and went a few kilometers. They killed 2,000 Palestinians in a few days. No Israeli wept. No Israeli said, I have an existential experience. They just got on with their life. This experience of violence perpetrated by Israel upon the Palestinians is a lived experience for the Palestinians. It is an experience of daily humiliation, indignity, persecution. A treatment, you say, we use the word second-class citizens. It's not second-class citizens, it's worse than that. They live in the occupied country. They live in occupied territories. Where are they coming from? We are all shocked because we are rational people. We believe that whenever we initiate a conflict, there must be a profit and loss effort so that we are able to manage. Place yourself in the mindset of the Palestinian. The Palestinian believes his life is so completely squalid, devoid of dignity, a misery, constant humiliation, and above all, no future. So what does the Palestinian do? He picks up a stone with the full confidence that he will be shot in the chest. But if you ask him, he will say, given the kind of life I lead, I would rather die with a stone in my hand than lead this misery. Everything is known. By the way, this kind of mass murder that the Israelis are doing that now, and which the Americans have done repeatedly in Afghanistan and in Iraq, massive bombardment. One day, the first day of American assault upon Iraq, 100,000 Iraqis were dead. That's mass murder. These people they took 3 weeks to reach this figure that we have with us today. There is an experience of this extraordinary violence that Western powers and their Israeli ally perpetrate upon people. So Hamas is a resistance movement. We have no experience of living under occupation. We had it in the freedom struggle. And we had, while the great bulk of our freedom struggle was quote-unquote peaceful, there were people within our fold who took up arms and are today venerated as heroes. When you live under occupation, you believe you have the right to take arms to end your misery, end the occupation, and get rid of the occupation force.
So, Talmiz, here, like I said, this is a very important insight into the emotional and lived experiences of different people and their histories. But I just wanted to ask you that the particular level of brutality, as I said, so if it was an attack, if it's an attack on installations, even if it is just, and I'm very aware of my words and how inadequate they are, but let's say if it is killing or if it is killing of forces, then there would be a very different reaction. But to particularly go for civilians, for children, to take old people hostage, and some of what we saw, which was of bodies being dragged around on trucks. I was asking you the question that, is this unusual? Would there have been support for that within the Palestinian people?
There is so much focus on what the Hamas did. Just go back a little bit and recall what the Israelis have done. Even in 2014, when the Israelis went into Gaza and those 2,000 people were killed, 500 of them were children. And the balance were overwhelmingly women. So murder of women and children has been a consistent Israeli practice over several decades. So let's not, and now of course, should the Hamas have done this? Hamas, as I said, is a terrorist organization, is a resistance organization. It lives under occupation. I'm not going to waste your time talking about terminology. The world has failed to detect to define terrorism, because terrorism is in the eyes, like beauty, in the eyes of the beholder. And that cliche, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, we've all lived with that. Academia has done away with this wasteful effort. We now use one word and 2 words, violent extremism. Violent extremism is a neutral term. Terrorist is value loaded. So we use the term violent extremism. Is the Hamas a violent extremist organization? Answer is yes, it is. Does it? And after that, we can debate depending on the perspective, as Navtej pointed out very, eloquently, depends on your perspective. As I said, terrorism is in the eyes of the beholder. If you're sitting in Israel, should Hamas have done all this? I would say no. And have you noticed one very interesting thing? There is a Hamas spokesman who said 2 days ago, we regret this. We made a mistake. It was a mistake to have attacked children and women and older people. Has anyone ever heard in the last 50 years an Israeli source saying, we made a mistake and we should not have killed all these children and women whom we have killed? In 2019, Hamas adopted Gandhian tactics. It was called Great March to the Border. It was to remind the Israeli people that there is a whole bunch of Palestinians who are refugees. Just as a reminder, a peaceful demonstration, not even stones in their hand. How did the Israelis respond to that? Through sniper attack. They shot people. That means there is this sniper, he's got a telescope, he spots a young person, locates his head and shoots the person dead. Most of the people killed, 250 Palestinians were killed in the march to the border. That was a Gandhian effort. It was answered with sniper attack. All of you recall last year, the attack upon Shirin, the Al Jazeera correspondent. Sniper attack. Very deliberately targeted, shot where she did not have protection, and she was killed on the spot. What was her crime? She was reporting not from the comfort of Paris, Washington, and London. She was reporting from the West Bank and from Gaza. Yes, ma'am.
So, Talmiz, I'll come back to ask you this question, which is about the amount of rocket attacks that there are from within the Palestinian, from Gaza. The fact that they could have 5,000 rockets to shoot at Israel, and that, if they are blockaded, they are isolated. And Israel's argument and defense is that it's they who are using the civilian population because beneath is a huge network of tunnels and this bombing of hospitals and ambulances. I just want to come back to that, while we are taking stock of the Palestinian sense of injury. But before that, I want to just bring Dinkar in. Dinkar, we heard two senses of how people feel their own wound and their own sense and lived experience. But as a diplomat, if you were, and I'll come to Iran, and Saudi Arabia, there are just so many players, America, India, there's just a lot of players in this. But just for the moment, as a diplomat, if you were to articulate this horrific sequence of events and repercussions that is taking place in a way where both would feel correctly represented, enough for there to be a possibility of a table of negotiation, how would you define what is going on right now?
Thank you, Shoma. I think Navtej and Talmiz have given you a historical perspective. Let me add just a few points. On the broader issue, I have lived in Middle East like Talmiz for long years. And what struck me, and I saw the same thing.
Can you just speak into the mic, please?
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. What struck me during my years in Middle East was that the Israelis and the Palestinians are the two most intelligent people in that part of the world, most talented. And it's very unfortunate they are fighting, and they are fighting for all the wrong reasons. That's what Navtej was saying, the Israeli or the Jewish sense of, fear or existential fear. That comes from European experience. And why should Palestinians have to pay for Europe's guilt? So that is the beginning of the problem. Now let me add a few points which you were raised earlier about the nature of Israel, Israeli government. It will be wrong to say that this is apartheid, because Arabs members are part of the Israeli parliament. And in fact, some of them were also part of the previous government. The second part is that Palestine issue cannot be equated with Hamas. There are two very different approaches to this problem. One which is represented by Fatah and Palestinian Authority, which is recognized by us, and the other is which is Hamas approach. And let me just add, Hamas is very unpopular even with most of the Arab governments. This is the reason why it was not simply the Israeli blockade of Gaza, but Egyptians had also done the same thing, because Hamas is seen as linked to Muslim Brotherhood, which the Gulf countries as well as Egypt are very uncomfortable with. So there is a history. I do not want to go to the other extreme and equate Hamas with ISIS, which is a completely wrong description. Hamas, the word in Arabic means aspiration. Now, the meeting point, I think we have to go before the current, conflict erupted. And this is what the UN Secretary General tried to do, to say that the conflict did not erupt simply on 7th October. And 7th October, of course, the events of 7th October, we must condemn. This kind of violence has absolutely no justification. But there's a long background. There was a two-state solution, which Israel had committed, and which has, just, drifted into nothing. So unless you address that political issue, a simply military, approach based on high tech does not work, which is what the 7th October events have shown. The way forward, I think it's most important to get those 242 civilians, or how many, one doesn't know how many of them, some of them have been reported to be killed, to get them out, because if they are killed by any, it may be just an accident. The Israeli public opinion will not accept going back to two-state solution, which is the only way out. And let me add, I have some experience of hostage situation. As Joint Secretary UN, I dealt with a very different context. This was, but much larger. 500 UN peacekeepers of 13 different countries were taken hostages in Sierra Leone, and I was sent along with then DGMO General Wijs. Later he became Army Chief. So first thing in such a situation, if you want to contain it, to get the hostages out. And now that was slightly different because they were, military people. Here they are civilians. And then you can address the larger issue. Now what I see, and I find it very disturbing, Israel is trying both the approaches. Their demand that the hostages should be released unconditionally, this is completely valid demand, but they are also combining it with a military approach. And, this trying to what is called restoring the deterrence, which means, resorting to violence, high levels of violence. And then this is also combined with the phraseology humanitarian pause, which essentially means, humanitarian pause, you look at it from Hamas's point of view. They let go of the hostages, which is their only leverage, and that brings them more violence. Why would they do it? So, there's an internal contradiction between these two approaches which Israel is following. So I think there are some encouraging, reports that Qatar has worked out some deal for release of some hostages for 5 days humanitarian pause. I hope that works out. I hope that is expanded. But otherwise, why not a grand deal that, ceasefire, announcement of two-state solution? You don't have to do it immediately. The first step would be, in this sequence, first step would be unconditional release of the hostages. But that requires, tempers to cool down. As President Biden said, Israel should not be consumed by rage.
Yeah, I think what Talmiz pointed out, that this huge disproportion of life lost, that in some countries, a huge number of lives lost doesn't count for, as Navtej was saying, that for one Israeli citizen, you're willing to let go or either release 1,000 Palestinians or kill 1,000 Palestinians, so that disproportion of life is something which is coming through so starkly in every war, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, it's really like a value judgment on life itself. And, about the hostage situation, that I would love to ask you as diplomats who've dealt with very difficult situations, that when you've unleashed this level of retaliation and so many people have lost their children and their people, 11,000 lives lost, at which, what is the vocabulary one would use to bring them back to the table, on what grounds would they order a ceasefire? Well, not a ceasefire, on what grounds would they release hostages? So those are things that I hope we can, begin to decipher. But Navtej, I just want to bring in a couple of other players into this, which is, Dinkar just said that why should the Palestinians be paying for European guilt? One was the Holocaust guilt, the anti-Semitism, the Nazism. It's the British that, as usual, put a partition line down an ancient place. They decided in the British mandate that there would be a Jewish homeland created. And I was reading an amazing statistic that there was just 2% Jews when this, back in 1917 in the Balfour Declaration. And then after the Six-Day War, in just those 6 days, there was a takeover of 77% of Palestinian land. And when President Trump came up with the deal of the century, 87% of this occupied 77% of Palestinian land was going to be retained by Israel, and there's 7 lakh new settlers in that tiny area. So these, when we're talking about, of course, the Holocaust and extreme suffering for centuries of the Jews, but the Palestinian suffering is very real and true as well, So please bring us, you've served in America, help us understand just the last 2 presidents. I won't even go back to, Clinton or to Carter or any of them, just between Trump and Biden. Do you think that America has been playing false? Was Trump's deal a good deal? Is Biden letting down the Democrats and all liberals? Help us understand America's game in this.
Shoma, if you permit, before I come to the 2 presidents, just to clarify a couple of things that have come up in the discussion so far. One, in addition to what I said of the 7th of October, whatever else has happened is that the Israeli sense of strength, has been shattered. That brand Israel, which was seen as the best army, the highest intelligence, that went out of the window that morning. So that also is a factor which has gone very deep in the Israeli mind. We must remember that. The point that you have mentioned, and Dinkar mentioned about the European guilt, the European guilt is being played out. Today you have Germany as one of the strongest supporters of Israel. It's being played out in America, it's being played out in the UK in particular. Now, if you're going back, you have to go back to at least 150 years, and we don't have the time for that. But even at the time of the Balfour Declaration, 1917, you're absolutely right, it was 2% was not the population of Jews, it was the land held by Jews was 2%. There were about 10% were Jews, and many of them have stayed there for centuries. So it's not that. But then people started coming in, and of course, during the British mandate, the British let it all, fester. And then finally, when they could not handle it, they handed it to the UN, and the UN said partition, and partition never took place. And there was war of 48, and then there was war of 67. Now, if you fast forward that to the American point of view that you want me to talk about, I think the last serious attempt that was made, at any kind of dialogue between the Palestinians and the Israelis was in the Obama-Kerry years. That is already 13, 14 years ago. And then it fizzled out. Clinton had done a lot of spade work. Every American president used to appoint a special envoy, used to make an effort. Trump went completely the other way. He decided that, we are going to have this so-called Abraham Accords. We are going to back Israel's normalization with the other Arab countries. And in the process, what Netanyahu joyfully called the outside-in approach. That if you sort out the outside, the inside will sort itself out. So there will be so many vested interests between Israel and the Arab countries that they'll all forget about the Palestinians. Now the Arab countries, frankly, don't need much to forget about the Palestinians. They've been forgetting about them for the last 70 odd years. There's been never really been any strong support. You know, yes, they had the Arab League plan and all that, but beyond that, not in real terms. So Trump did something else. He actually moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which means you have recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, that is one of the core issues of the dispute, the status of Jerusalem. It is the place which is the holiest, not just to the Jewish people, but the third holiest shrine for the Muslims and a very holy shrine for the Christians. The Calvary, the Holy Sepulchre Church, is in Jerusalem. So while Christianity is, away from the center of the dispute, the fact remains that Jerusalem is a very coveted prize. So Trump, in one move, moved it there. He shut down the American consulate in Jerusalem, which means there was nobody to deal with people in the West Bank. And he shut down the Palestinian representation in Washington, D.C., which has still not been opened to date. Now, everybody expected that Biden, when he comes in as a Democrat, will he sort of walk back on these issues? Will he go back to the peace process? I'm afraid that was particularly disappointing. None of the Trump steps were walked back by Joe Biden. And there was no real effort made for ending settlements or for starting a peace process. When things got very bad, somewhere at the beginning of the year, they organized a quick conference in the Negev desert, which I think Blinken and possibly Sullivan also went, and they said, yeah, Israel has agreed to stopping settlements for a few months. The very next day, Bibi Netanyahu said, we are not stopping settlements. So they have consistently ignored American suggestions. Not that the Americans have been particularly bothered. The Americans have actually been working very strongly on getting Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel. Now, if that had actually happened, and there's a theory that the Hamas timed its attack to disrupt that. I don't know about that. I'm sure Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad will shed light on that. But that normalization would have completely put the Palestinian issue in cold storage forever. Now, what this has done, this conflict, if there is a silver lining to it, and it's a horrible silver lining, that you have the Palestinian issue and the two-state solution being talked about again today. And it's the normalization which has gone into cold storage. So this is where we are. I don't know if the American approach so far in the conflict has not been encouraging at all. They have given immediate budgetary assistance of $14 billion, arms, ammunition, and Biden personally went there and has supported Israel's right of self-defense and all that. That is all to be expected. And that nobody really quarrels with because, that is expected Biden would go there. But what is expected is Biden would have called in stronger terms for a ceasefire so far. That has not happened at all. The way they have vetoed the resolutions in the UN Security Council and the way they have, at the moment, talked only of humanitarian pauses. From what one reads, he wanted 3-day humanitarian pauses. The Israeli agreed to 4 hours. Now, America, whether we like it or not, is the country that can, if they want, influence Israel. Will they do it? When they will do it? I don't know.
So, it's such a depressing scenario to hear you say that, that they have that power and they won't. And this is why I was asking you about, is there any moral language in which a country sees itself? One is that this happens outside of your eyesight. But in a 21st century, where one is seeing the level of devastation. You are seeing children, and there's this complete disbelief. I have friends in Israel, completely moderate friends, who there's no belief. They're saying the Palestinians are literally concocting these images of people dying. And, of course, now there's also a sense that the Hamas did not do this attack, so the Palestinians say the Hamas didn't do the attack. So you're living on this complete binary of something which everyone can see. And like you said, the Americans are completely cynical about it, So, and being ambassadors and diplomats, when you're speaking this frankly, it shows how much darker the truth is, actually.
Well, we could speak in couched language, but, if we are having an honest discussion, I think the fact is there's a actual war going on, and there is a propaganda war going on. If you listen to spokesmen, there is a completely different narrative going on in Israel, and a completely different narrative going on in several parts. And that is what is causing the division in France, in UK, in Germany, not Germany, in the United States. You mentioned the universities and all that. And I don't know if we can any longer talk of morality. I think we can talk of national interest. We can talk of, basic civilization and basic humanity. Now, France has broken its position and called for a ceasefire. Yes, it sounds very nice, but France has immediate problems. It's got the largest Jewish community in Europe, the largest Muslim community in Europe. So that is particularly open to internal crisis based on anti-Semitic attacks and Islamophobic attacks. So, every country is coming at it from its own view. Biden is, read his opinion piece, which he's justified his position in the Washington Post 2 or 3 days ago, which itself is an unusual step. A president of the United States writing an op-ed. But he's written an op-ed and he's trying to say, I went there, I did this, I told them, I'm heartbroken. You're the most powerful man in the world.
I just want to pick up some of those threads with Talmiz. Navtej spoke of this humanitarian pause that people are asking for, or a ceasefire. There isn't even agreement on the language around that. And as Navtej said that, America is unable to decide what position it's taking. It's cynical about it. How do you interpret India's role in this? And are there shifts in position on India's own foreign policy? We were one of the first countries to acknowledge the Palestinian state. We also acknowledged Israel as a state. We have a long history with Palestine. Now, we're very close to Israel. How do you interpret the fact that India abstained from the resolution asking for a ceasefire? And do you think that this transactional approach to foreign policy is right? Or how do you interpret it?
First, two very quick points about the issues you raised with me earlier, but which I didn't respond to. Number one, let's be very objective here. From the Second World War onwards, no distinction is made between military personnel and civilians when it comes to assault. Netanyahu very wisely reminded us that in the Second World War, the same allies bombed German cities and killed thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilians with no compunction whatsoever, and never bothered about any military targets or economic value targets, strategic value targets. They were killing women and children in huge numbers. He also reminded us about the bombing of Dresden, which is a blot on the British and which remains to this day. There was no strategic reason to have bombed Dresden, but they did that. So let us now stop this business of civilians were killed. How many civilians were killed when the Americans assaulted Afghanistan and Iraq? Did anybody count those civilians?
But Talmiz, when you make that point, and endless TV studio debates go on this whataboutery, and if you do that by that logic, then we should not be...
I made the point, let us not make this distinction anymore, it's a waste of time.
No, but if you don't make that distinction, then we would all shrug and eat our burgers while the Palestinians, which we are doing in any case...
That is happening anyway. Now, the second point, very quickly, is about the Americans.
Talmiz, may I just press you on that point? Are you seriously saying that one should do away with this distinction, because then there will be no borderline to any horror that you perpetrate?
I am saying something which is the objective scenario for the last 75 years.
Can you hear Talmiz at the back?
No single power in its conflict has ever distinguished between military and civilian targets. I'm just making an objective observation. Okay? It's not business of whataboutism. I'm just telling you this is the factual scenario and it is there with us. Bombings are done without discrimination. You don't have military targets, you have large numbers of civilian populations deliberately and consciously killed.
Yeah, Hiroshima, you name any of these.
Second point about the Americans. At least for the last 50 years or so, the Americans have not been honest brokers on the Palestine issue. Their administrations have consistently backed Israel. Israel is so deeply inveigled in the American political establishment that it is not a foreign policy issue for the United States, it's a domestic matter. The Israeli influence from the White House to the Senate to the Congress to the media centers to Wall Street and to every other entity anywhere is now under Israeli influence. Some of that influence may be waning, but you have the influence now of the Christian evangelists who for their own reasons are extremely supportive of Israel. So the Americans are today incapable of playing any role that would be constructive and useful. Look at the last 25 years. Can anybody recall a single moment when the Americans instructed Israel to do something and the Israelis were forced to do it? It has invariably been the other way around. Consistently, the Israelis have managed American decision-making. And when you had the JCPOA, Netanyahu actually went over the head of the president and addressed the Congress, attacking the policy of the US president, and came back very triumphant. He is the one who also persuaded Donald Trump to withdraw from the JCPOA, as he has very happily proclaimed publicly. Now, your question to me is about India. I am a critic. I am also disappointed. The first reaction of our Prime Minister was, I have called it emotional and ideological. Emotional because of the great warmth that is there between Hindutva, his ideology, and Zionism, and the emotional bond he sees between the two situations and also with Netanyahu personally. He called Hamas a terrorist organization in that first statement. In the second statement, an attempt was made not at moderation but at adding a certain point, said India supports Israel 100%, not true, not valid, and not fully documented. There is no survey in this regard. But the other point was that India supports the Palestinian cause and Palestinian state, whatever. Indian spokesman then spoke up and he said India and elaborated on the mantra that we have, that Palestinian aspirations, but we also called Hamas a terrorist organization. The cruelest thing that we did, and which will be something that will be noted, the humanitarian truce that was suggested in one of the UN resolutions, it has no value. It's a UNGA resolution, but India abstained. There is a justification and a long note has been sent, but nobody is bothered about that long explanation. They know India. I felt bad, let me say, because I would have wanted India to say that this is a time for truce. This is a time to pause the situation. So we did not do that. Since then, further course correction has occurred when Prime Minister spoke at the virtual meeting of the Global South, where he condemned all civilian deaths. So this was further improvement. And there is also now references to Palestinian aspirations, etc. So yes, it has been a very tortured process, and it has finally acquired a certain semblance of repetition of old mantras. But there is no engagement. There is no engagement with the issue. Indeed, I would say what has happened at home, that bothers me quite a bit. People are today not allowed to speak in universities in support of the Palestinian cause. Professors, they are serving FIRs on professors. I think that is not called for. I personally believe that is not called for. We are a free and open society, and people have had diverse views. I was interviewed the other day and I was attacked, and the person said, this war is going to become an election issue next year, early next year. And I said, excuse me, India has enough issues to discuss and debate in the run-up to the election. Political issues, economic issues, social issues, cultural issues. Why do you need to focus on something that's happening 5,000 kilometers away, which most of you don't even know about? You know nothing about the history of Palestine. You know nothing about the Hamas. And you have the temerity to say, I'm going to make this an election issue? That is not. I'm a little appalled by that. I don't believe this is the way we should have descended into this kind of quagmire. It's not called for. It doesn't do any credit to us. Now, many people say, what about the other Arabs? They are also. Other Arabs, if you ask me later, I will elaborate what they are up to, and I will be very objective there, and I will tell you where they are coming from. You asked me about the Indian position, I have responded to you.
Yes. No, Talmiz, I will come back to ask you about the Abraham Accords and why all the Arab nations have, shelved the Palestinian issue. But I just wanted to press one more point on the foreign policy moves that India has made. Foreign Minister Jaishankar sort of laid out their position by saying that because India is a victim of terrorism as well, that and in the UN resolution, because there was no mention of the Hamas 7th October attack, that they abstained because of that, and that the resolution would have been better phrased to be able to condemn the 7th October attack and then ask for a complete ceasefire is something I think nobody would have a problem with. But to elide the 7th October attack is also a problematic area.
I have great respect for our minister. He's my service colleague, and he has exalted the position of the minister in the narrative relating to our national history. So it's not my business to question what he has said. I respect his view, and I also seek a respect for my view. My view is simply this. Hamas had already been attacked. Been attacked in other resolutions. It's been attacked in various ways. There was no consensus in the United Nations Security Council. Whatever the attack on the Hamas, it had been vetoed. In the UNGA, this resolution was not about Hamas. It was about the Palestinian people. It was about the mass murder that was being inflicted upon the Palestinian people. It was seeking a truce, a moment of peace where these people could recover a little bit of their livelihood. Israel cut off water, cut off electricity, cut off military supplies, cut off food supplies to these beleaguered people. That truce was supposed to address that aspect. And for India to stay quiet, all of us know we are victims of terror, and as far as terror against India is concerned, all of us are united in opposing it. We are very clear on this, that anyone who raises arms against India is not going to be tolerated by any semantics. I was asked in one of the interviews when I mentioned about the Hamas, and I said they live under occupation, I was challenged, so what will you say about the Kashmiri agitation? I said, Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India. If anyone there raises arms against India, that person is a terrorist. But that is not the same thing as what the Hamas is going through. When we lived under occupation, did we not take up arms from time to time? And don't we now venerate all those people and put their pictures in our office rooms?
So, Talmiz, this opens up just so many areas of inquiry that I don't want to leave Dinkar out of the conversation. I'm going to circle back to you to press on a couple more of those points. Dinkar, I wanted to just bring in, because as I said, there's so many hands in this pie. There's one this axis of evil that America is very good at creating is around Iran. And I wanted to understand, how should India look at Iran? What is the relationship with Iran in this global discourse of good and evil, where those who are good are allowed to decimate thousands of other people's civilians, and it is not called terror, and it's not called an act of evil. It's seemed legitimate. But in this, there seems to be a huge consensus that Iran is really the crucible of evil now, and it's sort of the bad boy in the entire global politics. In this situation also, there's a suggestion that it's Iran really that's got the Hamas to attack. It's known that they support the Hezbollah, they support the the Yemenis movements as well. So how are we supposed to view Iran through the American eye as well as through the Indian eye?
Thank you. With your permission, let me just touch on a couple of points which Talmiz and Navtej have mentioned earlier. I entirely agree with Talmiz that, and I think Navtej has also said the same thing, that the Israeli response is disproportionate and it has no justification. Now, having said that, I do not accept this argument of blurring of distinctions between civil and the military. Talmiz is right. He is pointing to the history. And history is, it's a very disturbing history. But in the current context, if you take that argument, it absolves Hamas of the blame for attacking Israeli civilians, but by the same token, it absolves Israeli defense forces of indiscriminately and disproportionately using force against the Palestinians. Poor Palestinians, and let me touch on the point which you were raising about the US policy. I think President Biden, he may not have been as forceful as one would expect, the most powerful man in the world, as Navtej said. But, he said, where will these, he was talking about this order for the Palestinians to move south. Where will these poor people go? They have nowhere else to go. So now, having said these three things, let me come to your question, which is about the axis of evil. And let me start with a confession. I come from Lucknow. I'm a caste. And Urdu is, you can say, my mother tongue, in a sense, or father tongue. And Arabic was allotted to me, so I'm half Arab, half Iranian. And
cheers to that, actually. I think that deserves a round of applause. To be half Arab and half Iranian is really the need of the hour.
But let me add, I neither represent Iran government nor Indian government. And of course, that I'll come to that point also later, but let me finish this part. Iran was dubbed axis of evil by US after Iran had cooperated with US in the aftermath of 9/11, when the US needed access, overflights for conducting operations against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So it was very unfair to Iranians to be dubbed part of the axis of evil and to be clubbed with Saddam Hussein. They were one of the worst victims of Saddam Hussein. They lost 1 million people. If you go to Tehran, there's a garden, which is, it's actually a cemetery, which is where these people are buried. Now about Iran's role, and you mentioned that there is this perception, and it is there in Western media, that Iran has some hand in it. Now let me take you back to statements by US Secretary of State, US Defense Secretary, and President Biden himself. All three of them have said there is no evidence that Iran was involved in the events of 7th October. Now this is coupled with two other developments which have taken place. Nasrallah, this is the Hezbollah chief, he has made a statement, if I remember correctly, on 3rd November, in which he said, this is Palestinian file. Iran has nothing to do with it. So he has distanced both Hezbollah and Iran. And Hezbollah is supposed to be, or is projected as an Iranian proxy. I don't know how far that description is correct, because, these organizations have their own dynamics. And the third is that the story has come out. This was a Reuters story that, Iran was not informed about the events of 7th October. I don't know what is the veracity of this story, but let me take you to a statement by Iran's foreign minister. This was an interview to Financial Times. And this is, foreign minister is the highest spokesman of his country. And he has gone to the extent of referring to back-channel discussions with the Americans being conducted through US interest section in Tehran, which is manned by Swiss embassy, and where they assured that they have no intention of widening this conflict. And incidentally, this strand was also reflected in Hezbollah's statement. He said, we will only act if Israel launches a preemptive strike. So, this whole narrative that somehow Iran is responsible for this mess, I think is fundamentally flawed. Now, let me also go a little back in history. The current problem started with, I think, 1948. It's a problem of Zameen, land, that creation of Israel. Whatever be the justification, we have accepted, and I have great sympathies with Israel. But the problem was created in 48. Till 1979, Israel and Iran had perfect relations. Shah of Iran used to say that Iran and Israel are two people, Iranians and Israelis are two people surrounded by a sea of Arabs. So they are a natural ally. Now that context may have changed, but the fact remains that, as this shows, that Iran did not create the problem. The problem goes back to 48.
Right.
And there was an attempt to address this problem under President Clinton. Oslo process accepted by Israel, and they didn't act on it.
So, I'm just going to, because we're running out of time, I just want to have a quick prognosis from each of you. Like I said, these are just literally opening threads because we can't discuss something so complex in such a short time. But I think Ireland put it really well when they said Israel has every right to defend itself, but it does not have the right to do wrong, And I think if there's one line that kind of sums up this situation, it would be that. But this whole self-perception, like I said, we've heard about how Israel sees itself. We've seen how Palestine sees itself. But Iran, which is now, as I was saying, being described by all the powerful countries in the world who control, world media as this axis of evil, how do Iranians see themselves? Can you give us some insight which will break the stereotype that's being created around Iran? It would have to be very short, Dinkar. I'm sorry, because I want a quick...
There's no historical precedence of conflict between Persians and Jews. There's a whole history of conflict between Persians and Arabs. So as your question, how Iran sees itself, well, they think that they were, the Persian Empire, and they are the inheritors of that tradition. And this was voiced of all the people by President Ahmadinejad. He was criticized in Iran. I was an Indian ambassador for observing Nowruz, which is a traditional Iranian festival, pre-Islamic. And he was summoned to the parliament, and he said that if he is not going to celebrate Iranian tradition, should he celebrate the British or the German tradition? So the Persian tradition or Persian psyche, that's very strong. But let me just take 1 minute of your time. The current role, Iran has. What touches all economies and the leaders and the people? Oil price. The oil price has held, not because of anything which Americans have done. The oil price has held because of understanding between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the two regional powers. Because otherwise, this conflict, which is currently confined to a region which does not produce oil, would have spread to the Hormuz Strait, through which 20% of the world oil flows. So that restraint, and that is a continued restraint, which these both Iran and Saudi Arabia are following, which has a huge bearing. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Talmiz, I'm just going to ask you for two quick responses which we didn't touch on. One is that I had asked you that, if the Hamas is not being backed by Iran and they are beleaguered and they are, isolated in the Gaza Strip, where is this level of ammunition and rockets coming from? And that would be what the Israeli would throw back, that they are under constant attack from rocket strikes from Gaza as well. And the second one that we did not even touch upon is that how come all the other Arab nations have been so muted? We are criticizing America, we're criticizing India. What about the Arab nations and Saudi Arabia in particular, which is the absolute, the heart center of Islam, but it's been perfectly happy to set Palestine across. So what shifted, from the time when the Arab nations were fighting for Palestine to now when the Abraham Accords were well underway? What has shifted?
Firstly, with regard to Hamas's military prowess, it has constantly been upgraded. We cannot imagine that these are still that ragtag bunch of some years ago. There is evidence that, and there is suspicion, and Navtej may look at it shortly, Iran has played a certain role in developing the firepower both of Hezbollah and of Hamas. And today they are quite formidable. This is what is the worry. That's why the Americans shifted to aircraft carriers to the East Mediterranean. If Hamas has 50,000 rockets, only 5,000 of them penetrated the Iron Dome and created a certain degree of damage. Imagine what Hezbollah could do with their 150,000 rockets. So yes, there has been a lot of indigenous development. And see, we have to marvel at this. Iran has been under sanctions from 1979 and denied state-of-the-art, defense supplies, defense technology. Much of it has been developed on its own. It has got some of these most lethal drones costing $20,000 each, and they can take on, missiles and drones of the Americans, which cost $2 to $3 million. So that is how you develop capabilities and capacities when you are under extraordinary pressure. So this is how their prowess has come, and I have warned in an article recently that do not imagine that these are inert societies. Because they live under such squalid conditions, they are constantly developing capacities to hit back. So the Israelis, the shock that they got, in fact, I have stated, and I believe 7th October is an extraordinary strategic victory for the Hamas because it has seriously exposed the deficiencies of their political order under Netanyahu, the extreme right-wing element, and their much vaunted armed forces and their intelligence. We have known, I have asked this question many times and I ask it once more. When was the last time the Israelis fought a war? 50 years ago. Since then, what have they done with their armed forces? Killed hundreds and thousands of people from the air. People who have no army, navy or air force, who can't fight back, and then they say we are the world's greatest army. They could not fight the Hamas for one day. From 8th October onwards, the American military supplies started for the Israelis. The world's greatest army, second greatest army, God help us. This is what has been exposed. If the Israeli today is shaken and shattered and is experiencing an extraordinary existential epiphany, it is because of this event, that they have been shown in terms of their full nakedness as a military power and as a political power. Now, what was the other part of your...
I was asking about the Arab nations,
Arab nations.
But may I just ask you something here, Talmiz, that while the straight talking is necessary, but I'm just asking in these extremely aggravated, situations where words matter so much, that when one speaks like this, do you feel the necessity to caveat it with, the importance of caveating it with certain concessions about, say, what the Israeli experience is as well?
You're asking a personal question of me.
No,
in terms of my presentation.
Yes, I am actually. I am. Yes, I am.
Well, I'm glad you did that. But that I'll keep for a minute. Let me first about the Arab nation. Firstly, please, none of you knows me or hardly anyone. I am known for plain speaking, as I see it. Whatever I say is based on as wide a reading as possible. But what I say very often is not as diplomatic as my outstanding colleague here, Navtej Sarna and Dinkar. I have my way of doing things, and that is it. It's not at this age, I'm not going to change. And if I have said something which is wrong factually, it is obnoxious, or it is out of tune, I am very happy to be corrected because I want to learn. I call myself a student. I'm a permanent student. I do not speak with caveats. Now with regard to the Arab states are each and every one of them authoritarian states. To the extent possible, they attempt to co-opt support from their population. But if that co-option doesn't work, they are fully capable of extraordinary coercion as well. In authoritarian states, you have a divide between the interests of the ruling elite and the ruling regime, and national interest is conflated with their interest. In the case of the Palestinian issue, the popular opinion all across West Asia and North Africa is overwhelmingly supportive of the Palestinian cause, Palestinian aspirations. It is a defining issue as far as Arab identity is concerned, and it has not got diluted. Which is why, despite the posture of certain regimes, it remains a vibrant matter. What do the regimes want? The regimes, like Israel, would love for this issue to just disappear. That these people, 3.6 million people in the West Bank, 2.3 million people who live in Gaza, 200,000 Palestinians who live in the East Jerusalem, and about a certain number who live as Israeli citizens, they taken together are more than the Jewish population in that territory, which is why they live such squalid conditions in occupied territories. The Arab states would wish that it would go away. Their own populations do not allow it. Their populations don't allow it, and therefore they have to scurry around. The Americans had put a lot of pressure on Saudi Arabia because that is the jewel in the crown. That UAE doesn't matter. In a country of 6 or 7 million, there are 1 million Emiratis, 10%. There are 40 million Indians. So popular opinion doesn't matter in the UAE. UAE is a small state, it's a maverick state, it has a certain view of itself, but it has no strategic value. Bahrain even less so. Morocco got, because of popular opposition, they were not able to have full diplomatic ties. They have an aircraft going back and forth, and they're content with being a tourist destination for Moroccan Jews. Fair enough. Sudan was a great disaster for the Americans. The Americans desperately wanted Sudan to come on board, promised them $1 billion in development assistance, but these Sudanese don't play ball. They don't believe in democracy. They had a coup d'etat, got rid of the Democrats, and that is what you have. And finally, you have a civil conflict in Sudan, and there is no business about any normalization. Saudi Arabia, I think, had gone quite far. We don't know enough. The only statement we have from the kingdom is from Mohammed bin Salman, where he said, we are making progress day by day. That was all. Where the progress was it with the Americans, was it with the Israelis, we don't know. The three conditions that have come out in the public domain are all about the United States. Civilian nuclear program, state-of-the-art weaponry, and a security guarantee. I personally believe the security guarantee is not worth the paper it's written on. Nobody, no sane person in the world will ever accept an American security guarantee. Let's be very objective there. But what they did want was a nuclear capability. My personal view was, and I have not made up my mind, I think they were enhancing their capabilities, their domestic security capabilities, in order to have a degree of parity when they spoke to the Iranians. The Saudis have a long history of strategic vulnerability vis-a-vis Iran. 20 million versus 90 million, very major armed force, very self-sufficient, war experience. Saudis don't have any of this. So I think they wanted this. There is a commentary that Israel normalization with the Israelis was an add-on in order to appease the Congress. I don't know. In any case, whatever was happening, it is now very much on the back burner. I'm not sure in the near future it's going to be revived. Why do they do this? Because they feel, I want to make one general point, and with that I'll stop. 1967 ended the Palestine issue as an Arab issue in terms of military conflict. The Arab states said, we tried on your behalf, we lost, we have taken a very bad hit, now you are responsible for your own resistance. And the Palestinians have taken that mantle, and from that day till today, they look after their own resistance. They don't expect Arab support for that resistance. The Arab support is popular support that influences successive regimes. The Arab regimes at the end of the day are authoritarian, but they are not so tyrannical or so cut off from their own people that they don't know what is good for them. I don't think they are going to rush into normalization for a long, long time to come. But that is the explanation, that they sometimes get tempted by short-term advantage, and that is what I think was happening with regard to...
Just one, in a kind of literally a one-line answer, Talmiz. So is it a good thing or a bad thing that the it would have definitely lowered the temperatures of the Middle East. So is it a bad thing
Normalization is the most bogus development that we have had. How can you normalize when the scenario is not normal? You have 8 million people living in servitude and you can pretend it's not there? They have more people there under occupation than you have a Jewish population in Israel, and you pretend it's not an issue? Just because you have a messianic view, a section of the Israeli population has a messianic view that this entire land from the Jordan to the Mediterranean has been gifted to the chosen people, the Jewish people, by God himself. And it is written in the Old Testament, which is a lease document, and God is the landlord. And this is what... How can you, this land is so sacred that no non-Jew can stay here. People who have lived there for 2,000 years are unfit to stay there, and people who have lived in Europe are ready, and they are welcome there because they happen to be Jewish. This is a travesty. This is something that will need to be reviewed. As of now, it is an extreme right-wing view, but they are the dominant force. They don't have numbers in the Knesset, but they have an influence. And extreme right-wing elements, you are aware, and some of us have personal experience of that, they can be a lethal force. And they can rob you of your sanity and good sense.
Navtej, I'm going to turn to you for...
For relief?
It's like I said, what has been important about this is to actually literally look at the Rubik cube of this, and that each of it is true, and nothing that Talmiz is saying is not true, and then nothing that you were saying about the Israelis is not true, but the outcome is horrific, So I wanted to get from you, Navtej, what do you see as being the prognosis? There's been a sense that this could really conflagrate into a gigantic war that will spread like a contagion across the world. There was that sense in Russia and Ukraine as well, but somehow it's getting contained. Who do you think, all of you have been uniformly critical about the US. I think after US's departure from Afghanistan, it's become very clear, like he said, no one would, really rely on the US being your backers, even though they have supported Ukraine. But is the US going to play a positive role? What is the containing factor? How come this contagion isn't spreading? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, you saved the most difficult question. I think a lot of what happens now is going to define what happens immediately thereafter. Because President Biden has stated on record that we are not looking for the end of this war. We are looking for the end of this war forever. Now, that's one side. On this side, you have 3 objectives laid out by the Israelis, which we have mentioned. Hostages, finish Hamas, 3, change post-conflict reality of Gaza, whatever that means. Somewhere all these things have to come together. What the prognosis looks like is that there is no other solution to this problem than a two-state solution. A lot of people believe it is already too late for a two-state solution because you cannot move 7 million settlers. Well, that's what you would have to do. There is no...
7 lakh.
7 lakh settlers. There is no other solution to this. Given the destruction of Gaza, several things have been already, people are pointing out. 1, there will need to be a ceasefire. B, you will need to get the hostages back. 3, you will need to get somebody to take care of Gaza. And that somebody has been defined by the Americans so far as the Palestinian Authority. At the moment, the Palestinian Authority stands thoroughly discredited. Mahmoud Abbas has not held an election since, I think, 14 years or 15 years. It's known to be a corrupt organization. And if it comes with protection of Israelis to Gaza, it's not going to be popular at all. How the Palestinians are going to take care of, Palestinian Authority is going to take care of Gaza is only one way. And that is as overall, within the overall rubric of a political solution. So somebody is going to have to babysit this. The reconstruction can be done by with Arab money, etc. Americans have said there has to be an international security force there. The Bibi Netanyahu has already rejected that. The Chinese have called now for a conference of Arab countries and Muslim majority countries to discuss this. Whether Chinese reconstruction will happen, whether Chinese money will come in, that is another possibility that has opened up. But the fact remains that there has to be a recognition, and it is nowhere in sight within Israel, that you will have to give the Palestinians a legitimate, separate state with guaranteed borders and all other elements which go with statehood. How far Israel is from that situation, we have not had the time to discuss. We have not discussed what the Israeli government is made up of at the moment. What will happen to Netanyahu at the end of the conflict? Whether he will go, most likely, even Golda Meir went after 1973. Who will come in his place? How many concessions will they be making? What the place needs is leadership. And leadership, I simply don't mean somebody sitting in the Prime Minister or President's chair. Leadership means somebody with a vision, somebody who's a statesman. You know, you had the Sadat moment, and that is why you had peace with Egypt. You had a certain moment in the 90s, and you had the Oslo Accord. But at the moment, and particularly after this conflict, all this at the moment sounds like pie in the sky. And what you're most likely to get is a terrible situation which will continue like this. Maybe the guns will fall silent. Guns do fall silent. But you'll still be very far from a political situation unless something changes very dramatically.
I just wanted to say one thing, that after terror attacks in India, we have never pulverized another society. And so there are alternate ways of reacting to terror. And I think India at least offers that approach to managing conflict. Thank you very, very much, all of you, for your wonderful insights.
Thank you.